the nation, Rousseau, Wordsworth, and Coleridge. So within a romantic context, I will consider the oppressive representations of the nation by the Genevan-born writer and philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and the political imaginings of the nation by the English Lake poets William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who significantly surrounded themselves with nature within the context of the long 18th century. To begin with, I will place all three writers within a critical context that will suggest the significance of Rousseau's political views regarding the nation on the later Romantic writers, Wordsworth and Coleridge. Next, a consideration of Rousseau will demonstrate how these unapologetic political writings, and believe me, they are very unapologetic, include the political treatise, The Social Contract, and the philosophical novel Emile, both published in 1762, and how they argue for the supremacy of the individual above that of the nation, which has no natural authority over his fellow man. These political views will be seen to have influenced Rousseau's posthumously published life-writing Confessions, which has subsequently been identified as one of the earliest autobiographies. Further, within Rousseau's life-writing, qualities of Romanticism, including the primacy of the individual, are present. I will argue that Rousseau's romantic emphasis on the individual's thoughts and feelings through the first-person narrative of Confessions seeks to transcend the narrator's persecution and exile by portraying the importance of the individual in natural settings beyond the boundaries of any single nation. Following analysis of Rousseau, I will examine the canonical romantic text Lyrical Ballads. First published anonymously in 1798, this poetry collection would become a manifesto, not only for its authors, but for the entire Romantic movement. The 1802 edition has been chosen, as it is within its preface that the political views of Wordsworth and Coleridge rather, are made manifest as seeking to transcend the boundaries of a nation through imagining the individual as a citizen beyond the boundaries of any single nation. Finally, I will consider how Wordsworth's autobiography, The Prelude, posthumously published in the Victorian period in 1850, portrays the horror in France following the French Revolution in 1789. The 1805 edition of The Prelude has been chosen, as it was written at the height of the early Romantic period. Previous critical analysis of Rousseau, Wordsworth, and Coleridge has argued for the significance of the role of the imagination within the setting of Romantic writing. As an example, Marjorie Sabin argues for the imaginative faculty within Wordsworth's The Prelude and how this may have been influenced by Rousseau as a poet and not just a philosophical writer in the Confessions. This relationship between Rousseau and Wordsworth as self-representing men was last considered by W.J.T. Mitchell in 1990 within the context of autobiography. However, these analyses do not consider the significance of the nation and its impact on these Romantic writers. More recently, Michel Levy and Mark Perry argue that an evaluation of the Romantic canon over the last 50 years is still dominated by the big six male poets, including Wordsworth and Coleridge. What can be added to Levy and Perry's argument is the significance of Rousseau's political views on the later Romantic poets Wordsworth and Coleridge. This influence of Rousseau has been considered within Nicola J. Watson's analysis of the tourist draw of the Republic of Switzerland within the 1790s, which articulates the importance of Rousseau on 18th century tourism and Romantic writers. Building upon this consideration of the influence of Rousseau on the early Romantic writers, the non-canonical Rousseau, as well as the canonical Wordsworth and Coleridge, used the life-writing genre to transcend the limitations of the nation, both in Europe and the UK. This transcendence is achieved through portraying the supremacy of the individual's thoughts and emotions amongst nature, which can imagine a world beyond the political limitations of any nation. As an example, through the reimagining of Rousseau's childhood memories, the reader is invited to reflect on the persecutions to come, facilitated by the French monarchy and the Swiss Republic in Confessions. I could have spent in the bosom of my religion, my fatherland, my friends and family, a peaceful and pleasant life. The use of the past tense evokes sympathy and invites the reader to reflect on the idyllic life that might have been if it had not been for the nation itself. Similarly, the first-person narrative within the 1802 edition of Lyrical Ballads portrays the importance of the feelings of the individual. Within the lines written above Tintern Abbey, which hereafter I'll call lines, the narrator responds to the horror experienced in France following the French Revolution. And so I dare to hope though changed no doubt from what I was when first I came among these hills like a roe. The simile comparing the younger narrator to a young deer conveys the previously natural state of being that the narrator held, which has subsequently been corrupted by the nation itself. Within the political writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, these negative portrayals convey an oppressive nation that can be transcended through emphasizing the importance of the male individual, as well as the inferiority of women. The opening of the social contract portrays a nation of oppression. Man was born free, and everywhere he is in chains. Rousseau argues that the role of the individual is the most significant characteristic within the state. Even the hierarchy of the nation, however, must be considered within the context of the individual. For each individual can have, as a man, a personal will that is contrary or dissimilar to the general will. Rousseau argues that the individual can have contrary intentions to that of the nation. However, women are considered suitable only for the role of serving men. Men will philosophize about the human heart better than she does. And this hierarchy creates a male domination over women. But intriguingly, both are considered as more significant than the nation itself. This supremacy of the individual is explored further in Emile. The fictional character of Emile is used to discuss philosophical ideas surrounding education of children, whereby the natural state of humankind is corrupted by the nation, which stifles the nature within the child. As a result, the nation is seen as an oppressive and unhelpful burden on children. The ideal is a return to nature, as children can only learn from nature. Rousseau goes so far as to describe the Academy of Geneva and University of Paris as laughable establishments, only fit for making double men. This did not go down too well, as you can well imagine. The education provided by the nation is portrayed in a highly negative manner that only succeeds in making men corrupt. Rousseau builds on this argument by attacking the nation itself. For example, a patriot is identified by Rousseau as harsh to foreigners. And this has some disturbing echoes in our modern times. The solution is offered through individual autonomy, where natural man is entirely himself. It is only by moving away from the influences of the nation that a child can be raised as nature intended. And Rousseau builds upon this natural ideal. Written in exile after being forced to flee both Switzerland and France, and ironically take refuge in the United Kingdom, Rousseau's Confessions portrays the oppression encountered by the narrator at the hands of several nations. With a return to childhood, the first-person narrative opens by imagining a nation of citizens acting in constancy and fortitude. This idealized nation of honorable citizens is framed within a subjective narrative that allows for immediate responses to the narrator's tender and sensitive feelings. But these immediate responses to memories and nature seek to emphasize the importance of the individual. And further, the narrative creates an Edenic childhood, filled with song beneath the sturdy oak, a shepherd's vows, his repose allows only the thorn that lies under the rose. Notice how the repetition of natural imagery creates a positive Edenic scene that seeks to emphasize the importance of nature. And yet, despite this positive portrayal, the natural setting, and what we see at the end of the natural setting, rather, is the song ends with the more negative image of a thorn under the rose. This negative image invites the 18th century reader to notice the foreshadowing of violence to come, and there is an awful lot of it in Confessions. The narrative uses the foreshadowing to follow the innocent and Edenic scenes of childhood and juxtapose the negative realities of the isolated narrator in exile following the publication of Emile and the social contract. Within forced isolation amongst Lake de Bienne in Switzerland, the natural setting is amongst the lovely lake, whose shores, with the mountains that border it, enchanted my gaze. Use of alliteration recreates the sound of the water moving, inviting the reader into a calm and positive image. The country people themselves, who are significantly without a university education that Rousseau argue against in Emile, have souls that should leap up in ecstasy 100 times a day. This positive portrayal of those who live amongst nature, who can transcend their conditioning, reveals the significance of the common working individual. However, within this peaceful setting, the nation imposes fear once again. I received a letter from the Bishop of Nidau, the bailiff father of Nidau, to leave the island and their estates. Reading it, I thought I must be dreaming. Notice how the immediate response of dreaming conveys shock, disbelief. And the limitations of the nation return. They have not left the narrator. This encroachment of the nation results in the ultimate irony for Rousseau. Whilst born in the Republic of Geneva and espousing rather ideals of Republican classical Athens and classical Rome, Rousseau must take refuge for his political ideals within the constitutional monarchy of England. Further, within the final page of Confessions, the reader is made aware of the uncertainty of the narrator. While believing I was leaving for Berlin, I was in fact leaving for England. This uncertainty leaves the reader with a sense of foreboding, a highly negative representation of the nation. The final image left to the reader is a negative and hostile one, whereby the narrator confesses they wish their enemies to have choked. Very subtle. So this idealization of the individual amongst nature appears also within Lyrical Ballads. The collection was described within its original 1798 advertisement as experiments designed to ascertain how far the language of conversation in the lower classes is adapted to the purposes of poetic pleasure. And this explanation of the importance of the lower classes seeks to demonstrate the significance of all classes of persons within the nation. The 1802 preface frames the poetry within a political narrative that seeks to transcend national boundaries and focus instead on the importance of the individual. As an example, the preface identifies the purpose of the poems as to choose incidents from common life and to relate or describe them in a selection of languages really used by men. This demonstration of the importance and equality of the individual, in a manner resonant with the emphasis of the individual seen in Rousseau's political and autobiographical writings, really reveals important political imperatives. For example, Wordsworth's lines begins, 5 years have passed, 5 summers, with the length of 5 long winters. The declarative sentence juxtaposes the natural and positive imagery of the abundance and beauty of summer with the coldness of winter, which reveals a dark and conflicting image that subsequently frames the entire poem. Due to this framing, the 18th century reader is invited to reflect about what happened 5 years prior to the poem's publication in 1798. This invitation back to 1793 creates an emphatic reminder of the reign of terror in France, which would have been familiar to a reader in England during this time. Further, the iambic pentameter of the blank verse is interrupted by the use of commas, or of some hermit's cave, where by his fire the hermit sits alone. There's a capitalization of the hermit, which suggests a desire in the first-person narrator to be alone and to invite the reader to reflect on a solitary life. This representation of the isolated hermit lifestyle is contrasted with the lonely rooms and mid the din of towns and cities. Within the city, the narrator is isolated and surrounded by incessant noise, a highly negative image that seeks to invite the reader to reflect on the importance of a life away from the city. It is significant to notice within the final stanza of the poem how the individual feels and responses to nature are recognized as fundamental. The poem ends, "Thy memory be as a dwelling place for all sweet sounds and harmonies." Further, the somber beginning of the poem that reflects on the negative aspects of the French Revolution is contrasted with these final lines amongst the steep woods and lofty cliffs. Ending the poem on this positive image amongst the natural setting allows the reader to reflect upon how the negative aspects of the city and nation can be overcome by the individual amongst nature. I'm so sweaty I can't turn the page. It is a lot warmer down here, I tell you. It's my own fault for having long hair. However, what's really interesting also is how this idealized vision of the nation transforms or is transformed for Wordsworth within the autobiographical prelude. So, for example, in book 9 of the 1805 edition of the prelude, which would not be published until 1850, what we actually see are very negative realities of revolutionary France. The youth cut off from all intelligence with man and shunning even the light of common day. The image is violent and significantly moves away from the natural imagery of light and leaves only darkness. Thank you very much. This portrays the narrator's awareness of the politically charged negative atmosphere in the UK and European countries following the French Revolution in 1789. It's also interesting to notice, in a way very similar to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, that whilst the French state descends into anarchy, the capitalization of the king, the congregated host, the dire cloud, the king fallen, suggests how even nature objects to the overthrow of the king. But on his return to Britain, the narrator portrays the virtuous feelings through the heart of the English people. It's interesting how this positive image of the English people within the hierarchical constitutional monarchy is praised and appreciated, whereas Rousseau's fleeing of France to the constitutional monarchy of the UK and the relief of Wordsworth's narrator at their return home suggests how, even though they idolize the Republican state and seek to transcend it, the realities are that they realize ultimately that it's doomed to fail. So in conclusion, the portrayals of the nation by Rousseau show potential links with both Wordsworth and Coleridge. The political uncertainty leading up to the French Revolution in 1789 created an imaginative faculty within Rousseau that would subsequently influence Wordsworth as identified by W.J.T. Mitchell. Rousseau's imaginings have revealed how the unapologetic political and philosophical writings by him have created negative portrayals of the nation and argue for the importance of the individual, a key concept within Romantic writing. It has been shown how the influence of the individual by Rousseau on subsequent canonical writers Wordsworth and Coleridge is an example of going beyond the big six emphasis of Romantic writers such as Michel Levy and Mark Perry identify. However, the role of women within the nation is limited by Rousseau to subordinate roles. Further, Watson's views regarding the significance of Rousseau on later Romantic writers has been added to through an analysis of how all three writers portray the nation. Whilst imagining how the corrupting influences of the nation can be transcended by being amongst nature, the exile of Rousseau into the hierarchical constitutional monarchy of the United Kingdom reveals the ultimate irony of how the imaginings of the individual transcending the nation are met with the reality of a nation attacking the individual. Wordsworth and Coleridge's Lyrical Ballads portray political views that emphasize the importance of the common individual amongst nature through solitary figures. But it's also important to identify how the portrayals of the French Revolution in Wordsworth's The Prelude convey the horrors of France descending into violence, which contrasts with the portrayal of England as a safe refuge. Like Rousseau, the United Kingdom becomes a refuge for Wordsworth, free from the tyranny that the individual was supposed to transcend. In future research, Rousseau's influence on Wordsworth's early political writings could be explored further through the 1793 unpublished edition of the Bishop of Llandaff. Thank you very much. I'm absolutely boiling. Oh. It's boiling up here. We're melting.